back. It's taken 5 months with lots of quibbling over wording as the Israeli offensive in Gaza continued unchecked. The UN Security Council today passed a resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire, with the United States abstaining from the vote. That provoked an angry response from Israel, who said they'll keep fighting until all hostages are released. Hamas has welcomed the move. And Jonathan, I'll come to you first. It does feel like tonight Israel is very much isolated.
I think that Israelis quite largely feel that if isolation and reputational damage is the price they have to pay to continue a war, which is to defeat an existential threat on all of their borders, then that's a price they're willing to pay. And Benjamin Netanyahu, for all his unpopularity among some parts of Israeli society and clearly some parts of Washington, is the Prime Minister perhaps with a track record of standing up to American pressure the most of any Israeli Prime Minister.
Do you think, though, the price that Israel, and the Palestinians had to pay for this, 32,000 Palestinians dead, is this, do you think, how Israel should have conducted this operation, given they were the victims of October the 7th? And now, 5.5 months later, the world has more or less told Israel, what you're doing is not something that we find acceptable.
Well, those figures, of course, are highly contested and given out
by the State Department, not by the Pentagon, not by all of Israel's allies who are now echoing these numbers.
Those figures are given out by Hamas.
Well, are you saying that the Pentagon is picking up what Hamas is saying and running with it? They are using these numbers now.
Yes, I am. Those numbers are being given out by Hamas, and they've been demonstrated quite effectively by statisticians and others to not be consistent within themselves, as they've gone up in certain days. Certain daily counts of those very figures given out by the Hamas authorities have shown more women and children dying in individual days than total people who have died in that day. So they are literally inconsistent within themselves.
Well,
but back to your original question.
Let's go to the
back to your original question, because, undoubtedly there is suffering in Gaza and there is death. Israel, of course, says that it didn't want this war, but what it's done is conduct a military campaign that's been actually, in pure military terms, quite successful so far. The debate has been over whether they should be allowed to go into Rafah and continue.
I mean, you're saying that, but we've had, US four-star generals criticising this entire operation. The Americans, the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House have all said they don't want Israel going into Rafah without an actual strategy. They're saying there is no strategy.
That's absolutely right. I think Biden from the beginning has warned Israel that he's playing a very delicate balancing act between backing the operations, backing Israel and its right to defend itself, but also saying, we need a proportional response to some extent. And also, I think what's really coming out is that Biden really has to play the issues for his domestically, right? He has a voting base where he has a large Muslim population, which are voting for him. There's a large Jewish population.
But do you think the Americans have also played their cards badly in this? Because when you look at the outcome of this, the hostages haven't been released, the 130 or so that are believed to still be in Gaza.
Including Americans.
Including Americans. The number of Palestinian dead, the number is 32,000 that we're being told, and the Americans are using these numbers now. We've got a situation where, Hamas is not destroyed. The leader of Hamas, the man who did this, his head is not on a stake. And the relationship between Israel and the United States is estranged.
I mean, absolutely. This is another real failure, I would say, in American foreign policy, actually. And Biden, although he's, come out, even when we was looking at with the withdrawal in Afghanistan and now this, I would say certainly there's really, his track record has been terrible and has had a lot of difficulty in managing this. And certainly it's backfiring enormously. And there's the election in the U.S. coming up, and it's going to be very close. And certainly what's coming across is that the Israel question could really tip the balance in Trump's favor. It's one of the issues that could tip the balance.
The question then, Jonathan, is will Israel listen to these calls for a ceasefire? Are they likely to continue? Well, you've just come out. You've just left Israel. You were just there a day ago. What were you hearing there?
So Israelis are fairly united in their determination to defeat the enemies that they are encountering, not just Hamas in Gaza, but also Hezbollah in the north. And when we're talking about UN Security Council resolutions, it's worth remembering 1701, which actually requires Hezbollah forces to be north of the Litani River in Lebanon. They're not. And as a consequence, the buffer zone that's meant to keep Israel safe in southern Lebanon has actually been moved into Israel. So Israel, in that respect, has created its own buffer zone, evacuating thousands of its residents from northern Israel. So there is this threat in all areas. The Security Council didn't mention anything about that today. And more broadly, I think if we think about Rafah, for example, Israel's determination to go into Rafah, you said that America doesn't want them to. So far, they haven't. And actually, what's happened is
they've summoned.
What's very interesting
and
about
asked
it
them
is
to give a plan. They're saying there is no plan.
Well, from my understanding is that there is a plan, but we haven't got the details of it. But what's interesting, I think, that's happened there is that in all that time they've talked about it, what Hamas did, of course, is move all their troops back north. And Israel has recently been engaged in activities in the Al-Shifa hospital in the north, which you'll remember they actually went into some time ago. They've arrested something like 500 Hamas terrorists in the Al-Shifa hospital, from whom they'll be getting excellent intelligence now, partly as a result of this back and forth over whether they're going into Rafah. If the Hamas forces were in Rafah, they knew where to leave.
But you know, Jonathan, you say that this operation, from a military perspective, is a success. That's not what is being said globally, and that's why there is this pressure for Israel to stop. Do you think that they had another route or way of doing this? To be able to come out?
I mean, as I said last time I was in this studio with you, Yalda, people who criticise the country for what it's doing often don't suggest a better alternative. And I think the United States is one of those critics that hasn't suggested something better. But I do think that there is tighter coordination between the US and Israel than some would believe. And some of this is intentional. I'm not saying it's all intentional. There's certainly a rift at the moment. But having managed to evacuate terrorists from Rafah back into the Al-Shifa hospital and to capture them and interrogate them from there, Israel has carried out a strategic victory. The problem is, you're right, that if they're having military success, they're not necessarily translating it into strategic success so far in properly defeating Hamas. And that's why they want to finish the job.
It's hard to know what the military success of this has been as well, given that the Americans are telling them to stop and not go into Rafah without an actual plan. But Jonathan and Livia, thank you very much for your time. Jonathan, the US intelligence community have said they have a duty to warn, even if it is their adversaries. They did it in January with Iran, where there was an attack that ISIS-K claimed responsibility for, and now this time as well. But as Livia was saying, I mean, this shows this complete breakdown in that kind of communication.
I think Islamic jihadi terrorism is something that is a problem for the whole world, and it doesn't exclude Russia, doesn't exclude Europe, doesn't exclude America. So I think there is an obligation for states to share intelligence in the fight against that force. And I think that we need to remember here in Europe as well that we're not immune from it either. The attack that took place in Moscow is not dissimilar to the attack that we saw in the Manchester Arena bombing or the attack in Paris at the Bataclan. Both of them, I remember reporting from the scenes immediately afterwards. They're horrific. And this kind of horrific terrorism that is taking place around the world is a shared threat, despite the animosity we might have to some of the states where it's taken place. So I do think it's important that the intelligence is shared. And yet, I don't think that intelligence is necessarily enough, because intelligence is all about interpretation. You may have intelligence that something might be happening or that there is movement or noise about something going on, but that doesn't mean you can necessarily prevent it. So in the longer run, I think it's an important thing that we should counter the forces behind the terrorism more conclusively so that these terrorist events don't take place and aren't successful.
I mean, the US president, and in their sort of, national security documents, they said some years ago that the war on terror is actually over. We're focused on great power competition with the likes of China, for example, and Russia, and that this issue has been contained. It was one of the reasons why they said they were happy to leave Afghanistan as well.
I mean, absolutely. And now we're really seeing it backfire. I mean, certainly all of this is in part, ISIS-K has very much been strengthened as a result of the U.S. retreat from Afghanistan. And certainly this is a power vacuum that the U.S. has left. And this is what we're seeing as a result, I would say.
I mean, what we're also seeing is that if the United States were to now work with the likes of Russia and Iran and the Taliban. I mean, it's sort of a case of my enemy's enemy is my friend, because they're dealing with the same issues.
Well, I think that the retreat from Afghanistan is an interesting point to mention, because by retreating from Afghanistan, we allowed ISIS-K and Islamic jihadism to reform and re-strengthen there and carry out these attacks around the world. And that is, in effect, what Israel is saying about Rafah, which is if you don't let them finish Hamas off, another Islamist, Islamic jihadi organisation, if you don't let them finish them off in Rafah, then the same could happen there. And I think that looking at Russia and what happened just now with ISIS-K, there are maybe lessons to be learnt for elsewhere in the world about actually fighting the true nature of Islamic terrorism.
Well, we're going to come to the Middle East in a moment, but just to stay on the point of Russia and how to deal with this, you've also lived in Central Asia, you've worked in and operated in places like Tajikistan. Many would question now, why Tajikistan? Why are 3 of the 4 attackers Tajiks? But actually, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, even Afghanistan, as we've been talking about, are vulnerable because they are weak, poor states.
Yeah, absolutely. Tajikistan is the poorest of the Russian post-Soviet republics. There's approximately 2 million migrant workers in Russia, and those are the official numbers, but there's probably many more. And also Tajikistan, as you know, it shares a very long border with Afghanistan. The border is very porous. So in many ways, the Tajik population is quite vulnerable for recruitment to this group. There's vast amounts of racism in Russia against Central Asians. They're hardly recognized. Even now, there's been reports right away that there's been retaliations in Moscow against Central Asian communities on the street. They're scared to go out, which is just very much demonstrates how bad the conditions that they're living in. And that certainly makes them much more vulnerable to being recruited, to helping the fight against Russia.
Just very briefly, Livia, do you feel now that Vladimir Putin thinks he needs to do something?
It's very difficult to know what his next moves will be. He will certainly probably try to wait and work out his next steps. I mean, there's a possibility that he could use this to escalate in Ukraine. We've seen him in talks with Central Asian leaders. There's also been, talks that he could be cracking down, investigating more Central Asian communities, cracking down on migrant communities and trying to do further interrogations, which would be very brutal.
Yeah.
So we'll wait and see.